Owning a shopping mall sounds like the ultimate real estate investment. You build the building, fill it with 60 or 80 stores, and spend the rest of your time collecting checks. Every tenant pays you rent every month while you own the parking lot they all depend on. The building appreciates, the leases renew, you become, in theory, a landlord to an entire economy in miniature. That's the pitch. The reality starts falling apart the moment you look at who's actually paying what. The biggest, most recognizable tenants in any regional mall, the department store at each end of the building, the ones whose names appear on the exterior signs, often pay rent so far below market rate that it would embarrass a modest strip mall in a mid-sized suburb. And the small stores that actually fund the operation are only willing to pay their premium rates because of the foot traffic those big tenants bring. Take the anchors away and you don't lose a couple of large tenants. You can lose the financial logic of the entire building at once. Not slowly, almost overnight. That mechanism is hiding in the lease structure of every shopping mall in America. And it explains why, over the last 15 years, hundreds of malls that looked healthy on the outside were quietly becoming insolvent on the inside. Most large American malls are owned and operated by real estate investment trusts, REITs. A REIT is a publicly traded company that owns real estate and is legally required to distribute the majority of its taxable income to shareholders. Companies like Simon Property Group, the largest mall REIT in the country, own portfolios that span more than 100 properties simultaneously. Here's the thing almost nobody talks about. Those properties typically carry enormous debt from the moment they're acquired or built. A regional mall might be financed using loans worth 60 to 70% of its assessed value. For a large mall, that's hundreds of millions of dollars, often packaged and sold to investors through what are called commercial mortgage-backed securities, or CMBS. These are pooled real estate loans bundled together and sold in tranches. Similar in structure to the mortgage-backed securities that became infamous during the 2008 financial crisis. CMBS debt matters for one specific reason. It's almost impossible to renegotiate. Unlike a conventional bank loan where a borrower can call the lender and work out new terms, CMBS debt is held by thousands of anonymous investors in sliced-up securities. There is no single party to negotiate with. When a mall's income falls, the debt doesn't adjust. It stays exactly where it was, due every month, regardless of what's happening to the tenants inside. The income needs to cover that debt before it covers anything else. That's the foundation the whole model sits on. Now here's where things become genuinely strange. Walk through any large regional mall and look at the stores at either end, the anchor department stores. They might occupy 150,000 square feet each. They employ hundreds of people. Their names are printed 40 feet high on the building's exterior. To any reasonable person, these look like the most valuable tenants in the entire complex. What do they pay for all of that? In many cases, a fraction of what the stores around them pay. Anchor tenants have historically negotiated rents far below market rates, sometimes just a few dollars per square foot annually in exchange for the traffic they're expected to deliver. And some didn't pay rent at all in the traditional sense because they didn't lease their space. Sears, in particular, owned the land and structure of its in-mall locations at hundreds of properties across the country. It wasn't a tenant, it was a co-owner of the real estate underneath everyone else's feet. Meanwhile, a small accessories retailer 20 feet inside the main entrance might be paying $50, $70, or over $100 per square foot per year, depending on the market. The same building, the same foot traffic. Dramatically different economics. This is not an oversight. It's the entire logic of the model.
The mall owner isn't selling retail space. The mall owner is selling access to foot traffic. The anchor tenant, by drawing thousands of visitors to that end of the building every week, is manufacturing the product that every other tenant is actually paying for. The Macy's brings shoppers in. Those shoppers walk past 30 other stores on the way back to their car. Those 30 stores capture the traffic and pay a premium for that exposure. The anchor gets a discount, because without it, there is nothing to sell. For decades, this arrangement also came with an additional financial layer called percentage rent. Beyond their base rate, tenants would pay the mall owner a percentage of their gross sales once those sales exceeded a defined threshold, typically called the natural breakpoint. If traffic was strong and stores were performing well, the mall owner captured more revenue automatically. A good year didn't just mean full occupancy. It meant bonus income flowing in from dozens of leases simultaneously. This was the machine working as designed. High foot traffic drove strong sales. Strong sales triggered percentage rent. The owner captured upside. Everyone's incentives aligned around the same shared asset, the crowd itself. The crowd was because here's what those same leases contained on the other side of the performance equation. It's called a co-tenancy clause. A co-tenancy clause is a provision that gives a tenant the right to pay substantially reduced rent or terminate their lease entirely if overall occupancy in the mall falls below a specified threshold, or if a named anchor tenant closes. The inline retailers demanded this protection because they were making a specific bet. They were paying a premium for access to a crowd, and if the crowd disappeared, they weren't willing to keep paying at premium rates. In normal conditions, co-tenancy clauses are invisible. Malls stay full. Anchors stay open. Nobody invokes anything. But what they create is a hidden dependency chain. The moment a named anchor closes, co-tenancy clauses activate across the building simultaneously. Dozens of smaller tenants suddenly have the legal right to pay dramatically less, or to pack up and leave. The mall's revenue doesn't decline gradually. It can crater, almost instantly, triggered by a single departure at the end of the building. And the debt doesn't move. No story demonstrates this mechanism more clearly than what happened when Sears began its collapse. Sears had spent much of the 20th century as the dominant American retailer. At its height, it operated thousands of full-line department stores, many of them occupying the anchor position at major regional malls. And, crucially, many of those locations were properties Sears owned outright through decades-old land deals. In 2005, financier Eddie Lampert engineered a merger between Sears and Kmart, creating Sears Holdings. What followed was a decade of sustained underinvestment, leadership instability, and declining sales as the company failed to adapt to changing retail habits. By 2015, facing severe liquidity pressure, Sears spun off a large portion of its owned real estate into a separate entity called Seritage Growth Properties, essentially selling and leasing back its own stores to raise cash. It bought time, not a turnaround. The retail business kept deteriorating. Store closures accelerated. In October 2018, Sears Holdings filed for bankruptcy, with hundreds of locations still open. What happened next played out differently at each mall, but the pattern was consistent. When a Sears closed in a mid-sized regional mall, the anchor space went dark. Because Sears had often owned that space outright, the mall operator received no income from it and had limited control over what happened to it. The building sat there with a boarded-up entrance and a largely empty parking lot on one end. And within weeks, co-tenancy clauses began activating across the rest of the building. Tenants who had paid premium rates for years suddenly had the legal mechanism to pay far less. Some reduced their rent. Others chose not to renew at all. The building might still report 75% occupancy. The income structure had already been severed. One closure did not remain one closure. It moved through the building's lease structure like a current through a wire. This is the mechanism behind what analysts began calling the death spiral of struggling malls. And the phrase is accurate because of how the sequence accelerates. It doesn't begin with a mall suddenly going empty. It begins far earlier, with a slow erosion of foot traffic that barely registers on the occupancy reports. E-commerce diverts shoppers gradually, then faster. Foot traffic falls. Percentage rent clauses stop triggering because store sales aren't hitting their breakpoints. Inline tenants underperform. Some close. The building thins out. The remaining anchors find themselves in a less appealing, less trafficked environment and begin questioning their lease renewals. When one anchor eventually departs, the co-tenancy clauses activate. Revenue collapses. The common area still needs to be heated, cleaned, and secured. The debt still needs to be serviced. The cost structure doesn't shrink when income falls. The visible signal, an empty storefront, is the last step in a process that started years earlier in the financial statements. This also explains why occupancy rates, the headline metric the industry loved to advertise, became increasingly misleading as a measure of financial health. A mall can post 82% occupancy while carrying tenants who are paying reduced rates under co-tenancy protections, while its percentage rent income has dropped to near zero, while its anchor spaces are under renegotiation. The building looks functional from the parking lot. The income statement tells a different story. General Growth Properties, at the time the second largest mall REIT in the country, with a portfolio of more than 200 properties, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in April 2009, carrying roughly $27 billion in debt. The company was not operating empty malls. Many of its properties were occupied and operational, but the debt structure, largely assembled through acquisitions made during the real estate boom of the mid-2000s, assumed a level of consistent income that couldn't survive either the 2008 financial crisis or the underlying pressure on retail economics. It emerged from bankruptcy and was eventually acquired by Brookfield Asset Management. But the episode demonstrated that a mall portfolio could be financially insolvent, even while the buildings inside it were still technically open. The malls that are genuinely thriving today have solved the problem in different ways. And the solutions tell you something important about which part of the original model was worth keeping. The highest performing properties moved aggressively upmarket. Simon Property Group's flagship locations repositioned around luxury retail, premium dining, and aspirational brands that e-commerce hadn't fully replicated. The logic was that in-person shopping still has something to offer, but not to every demographic equally. The shoppers who continued visiting malls in large numbers tended to be higher income, and they came for experiences that required physical presence. Treat the mall like a destination for that specific customer, and the economics can still work. Others abandoned the retail model for anchor space entirely. Medical offices, fitness centers, apartment complexes, hotel properties, college campuses, and even fulfillment centers now occupy what were once department store footprints at dozens of former regional malls. The co-tenancy clause problem disappears when the anchor is a radiology clinic. It doesn't generate foot traffic for the remaining stores, but it generates rent. Reliable, non-retail rent that isn't subject to the same consumer behavior pressures. The most ambitious projects tried to manufacture destination status through entertainment infrastructure. The American Dream Mall in New Jersey, which cost approximately $5 billion and required nearly 2 decades to complete through multiple ownership changes, contains an indoor ski slope, a water park, and an amusement park alongside its retail. The underlying theory, people come for the experience and buy things while they're there, is a reasonable response to the question of what physical retail can offer that a website cannot. The execution, particularly in the face of COVID disruption following its 2019 opening, has been considerably more complicated.
If you modeled the realistic outcomes for mall ownership today, you'd get 3 distinct scenarios. In the best case, a Class A property in a dense, affluent market with luxury anchors, strong traffic, and active management, the economics still work well. Rents are higher, vacancies are lower, percentage rent continues to flow. The property justifies its debt service with margin to spare. There are roughly 100 of these malls in the United States, and they are doing fine. In the realistic middle case, a competently managed regional mall in a mid-sized market, it's a tighter operation. It requires constant active management, attracting replacement tenants quickly when stores close, investing in renovation and experiential upgrades, managing anchor relationships carefully, and monitoring the co-tenancy exposure in the lease stack at all times. The returns exist, but require genuine operational work to maintain them. In the declining scenario, the margin disappears. The debt payment doesn't adjust when an anchor departs. The operating costs of the common area, the HVAC, the security, the cleaning, the parking lot maintenance, don't shrink when revenue falls. Every additional vacancy activates more co-tenancy protections for the tenants who remain. The math becomes irreversible before the building looks obviously empty. The failure scenario isn't a slow fade, it's a threshold. Cross the wrong line, lose the wrong anchor, trigger the wrong clause, and the cascade begins. So here's what a shopping mall actually is. Beneath the floor plan and the retail signage and the food court, it is a machine for manufacturing foot traffic, financed by debt, with its income structurally dependent on the tenants least likely to generate meaningful rent. The anchors create the crowd.
The inline stores pay for access to that crowd. The owner captures the spread between those two facts. That spread funds the debt, the operations, and the return. The machine worked for most of a century because physical retail had no meaningful competition. The only place to browse and buy was the store, and the stores needed to be where the customers were. The mall was where the customers were. The machine didn't collapse because e-commerce replaced everything. It collapsed, where it collapsed, because the model only needed to lose enough foot traffic to trip the financial triggers that were hiding inside it the entire time. The co-tenancy clauses, the CMBS debt that couldn't be renegotiated, the percentage rent income that disappeared when sales softened, the anchor tenant that had owned its building for 50 years and could simply board up the door and walk away. Owning a mall was never passive income at scale. It was a highly leveraged bet that a crowd would keep showing up, and that the financial architecture built around that crowd could survive if they didn't. Some malls made that bet and won. A larger number, over the last 15 years, did not.